one of the sort of things I would throw out as a somewhat contrarian idea is that you want to be building businesses that are so valuable that investors are willing to invest a great deal of capital. And the businesses that are just smaller incremental businesses that only cost a modest amount of money are not necessarily as valuable, because a lot of people can start them. If I had a business, say, if I said, I'm going to write a screenplay in Los Angeles and it only costs $10,000 or less than that to write a screenplay, it's a very cheap business, and you can have thousands of businesses writing screenplays, but there's a very low barrier to entry and possibly not that much value. So I think one of the things that's true is that super capital intensive businesses are generally less valuable, because at some point they're so expensive they don't work. I think this tends to be true of a lot of the clean tech companies these days. It's probably true of a lot of traditional biotech where it costs $1 billion to develop a drug or something like that. On the other end of the spectrum, though, if you have a business that only takes $250,000, $1 million, $500,000 to get started and get to break even, that could be a phenomenal business, but it's also quite possible that it's the sort of business where you could actually have 100 other people competing with you, and so it may sort of be a lot less valuable. And so sort of a very the sort of post-mortem I have is that even though it would have been good for us to have built a new payments company, and the starting point of a new currency that's still getting created today on less than the amount of money we did, it was actually much more important to have a business that was valuable enough and where the idea was big enough that you could do something like that. Anyway, with that, I'll open up to questions. Ben, I thought it would be good to get a little bit of the PayPal history, but I'd be happy to talk about that and anything else people might have questions about. Thank you very much.
Of course. Is there someone over there who has a question?
Can you tell us about your investment in Facebook and how that happened? Now that you've looked back at PayPal, bring us into Facebook.
I'm not gonna say anything about Facebook. Every time I talk about it, I feel like I'm hyping the company too much, and so I think anything I say would either be understating the case or would sound like hype. I think it's still too close. And that's not hype.
Of all the money that you guys spent before you dropped to the 180 million, you say you spent a lot of money on customer acquisition. And how much was spent on customer acquisition as opposed to, let's say, technology based on fraud control, which is what PayPal really prides itself on now?
It was probably we probably spent close to about $70 million on marketing, and that was probably more than we needed to in retrospect, because when we turned down the bonuses, people still kept using the product, which was a good sign. The fraud piece alone probably was we easily lost maybe 45 million on fraud before we broke even. And in some ways that was, it was necessary for us to lose that money to learn, what could be done. And so if you had run a super conservative payment service where you didn't lose any money at all, you probably would not have learned those things. So in some sense that was, even though it was not a technology cost, it was probably close to necessary cost for running the business. And then, the rest was, building a team, large operations, customer service piece, which was maybe not directly in technology, but was definitely necessary for building it out. So I'd say aside 70 million marketing, the rest everything else.
Peter, Simon Bull, founder, CEO of Lidzar. I have a very simple question. When you first launched PayPal, who were your biggest competitors at the time, and what did you do to stay ahead of them?
Well, there were surprisingly there were a whole series of companies that were basically trying to create new online currencies. None of them had really gained tremendous traction, and so we basically decided you had to do something where you leverage the existing currency and use dollars rather than try to create a new currency, although you would do it in a new format. We had And then outside of that, we had basically a series of competitors that were created by various financial institutions trying to copy PayPal. But basically, the people who were trying to create totally new businesses weren't thinking enough about how you created product that worked. The people who were in the finance industry were too worried about fraud, and there were a whole series of. Western Union had one, Citigroup had one, a whole series of these competing payment services that were created very shortly after we launched, but built out much more slowly.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask you, what was your biggest mistake that you made in your first couple of years, and what did you learn from that? And what mistakes do you see startups making in their first year, and what advice would you give them? JDFBB.com.
Well, I don't, I think the, and there were probably a lot of different things that we could have done differently. I think one of the sort of categories of mistakes we made, which I don't think we made too much of, but probably, like, if I could do it over, I would have made even less of, was there was a sense that we had no idea what we were doing, and we were hoping that there was going to be somebody who would tell us what to do. And in fact, there is nobody to do that. There's no man standing. There's no wizard. There's somebody behind the curtain. Most of the time, there's not even somebody behind the curtain. And so there were there were thoughts that we could get really good investors on board who knew a lot about startups, and we had sort of one of our biggest mistakes was getting Idealab, or it's now called Clearstone Venture Partners, which was just, they were like the investors from hell. And basically, it was like the board meetings were like, we'll figure out if you don't change these things to make it more favorable, we'll destroy the company, and on and on. It was like just miserable people. And basically, we sort of got the vibe, these people are kind of bad people before we took their money, but we thought, they're actually really smart people, and so we should work with them, even though they're kind of bad people. And I think sort of one of the big takeaway lessons is if you think someone's a bad person, you shouldn't work with them. And in a startup, you should basically, it's like a team, and the key dynamics are internal to the team, how well those work. And if people can work together really well, you create great companies. And if they don't, it tends not to happen. And in that sense, I think the closest thing I can come up with is that it's like a sports team or something like that that people have to really play together well on in order to win. And so I think we sort of pushed a lot of things that direction. We hired a lot of people we knew. There were problems with that because if you hire your friends and things don't work out, there are problems. On the other hand, in that context, it turned out to be a very good thing. So I think you don't want to start a company where it's someone you just met 2 weeks ago, you've never talked to before. It's like getting married to someone you meet at a slot machine in Las Vegas. You might get the jackpot, but chances are it's not a good idea.
One last question, I guess.
Yoav of Wild Ventures, not a venture capitalist, but I found that one of those payment companies that you referred to that towards the late 90s, we ended up selling early to CMGI in September '99. And I had a lot of regrets about selling early, but I want to ask you whether you think you might have sold early, because you've seen companies like Google, Facebook, now Zynga approaching probably double-digit billion valuations, and looking at what eBay is doing with PayPal now, which is really awesome, with people like Osama and others. Do you ever have any regrets for not sticking around and maybe selling it for 10 times a month, or keeping it a public company at that valuation?
I think I don't have any regrets about what we did. I think there were extremely good reasons for it to be combined with eBay. I would say most of the time tech M&A doesn't make a lot of sense. So most technology companies don't naturally combine with other companies. And so if you ask M&A works because typically in an old economy context, M&A typically works because you have sort of these scale efficiencies. So it's like one bank combines with another bank, and we can close down half the branch offices and fire a bunch of people and get economies of scale. Tech M&A on a big scale is typically not about efficiencies, but it's about like some sort of complicated product synergy story, which almost never exists. So I think most tech M&A doesn't actually work, at least on a big scale. And the eBay PayPal thing was a very unusual thing where there was an enormous synergy. So I think it was the right thing. I don't think PayPal would have been nearly as big had it remained a standalone business. And I mean, I'm not saying all M&A is bad. I think there certainly are a number of cases where things are synergistic, but it is that is certainly it's not as common as people think. This was a rare exception where it was like the Walmart store and a different company running the cash registers, and it probably made sense for that to be one company.
I actually do have a question for Peter. If you quickly can respond to this. We're 5 minutes behind, so we're actually making good time. So it's about there's a lot of startups here who are looking to raise some funds, and there's this whole movement, the lean startup movement or the top startup. And so I think it would be great to hear your perspective on your thoughts on the lean startup, and also how entrepreneurs should think about how much money do they really need to raise, and the milestones they need to hit. What milestone can they actually hit with $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, or do they need to actually raise a lot of money?
Well, I do think that the correct answer is you should get as far as you can on as little money as you can. So nothing I say should be construed differently from that. At the same time, I think that there are certain types of companies that by their nature take more capital than other types of businesses. And I tend to think that if you're going to start a company, if you're going to take the risk of starting a company and try and do something that's going to change the world, you might as well actually try to start a company that's really going to change the world, and that's really going to be big, and that's really going to make a difference. And in my experience, those sorts of businesses typically require more capital. So I think it comes down to what the story of the business is, what it is that it does. I like to, it's not like completely dogmatic about this, but when we look at the portfolio of companies that we have at Founders Fund that we've invested in over the years, most of them have, the really good ones have lost enormous amounts of money and have taken years and years to get to profitability. And so if someone comes to me and says, I have an idea where we'll be profitable in 6 months or 12 months, I tend to think that's not great, because it means that you don't actually have enough capital you can invest. We're living in a country where interest rates are 2.5% on 10-year bonds, and if you can't actually borrow money and invest it at a higher effective return rate, and in fact you should be losing money. You should be building something where you're able to deploy capital in a big way for many, many years and build a valuable business. That seems to me to be the correct thing as an investor. And parenthetically, I also think it's somewhat it's not the conventional wisdom these days. And so I think that's probably where the really interesting businesses are that are going to be built, are the ones that are somewhat more capital intensive. Take at least 5 to 7 years to get to profitability, and so basically, and then turn out to be extremely valuable because they have no competition.